This is Clay Rooks at City College. I want to talk to you today about argument. Now this will just be an overview because argument is a very involved topic, but we're going to take a little bit of a look at it here. The first thing to realize is that argument is when you try to convince someone by using logic and persuasion to agree with your point of view or to follow a particular course of action that you want, or to do both of those things. During this discussion, we're going to look at several points. The first one will be to look at logical and persuasive appeals. Then we will look at inductive and deductive reasoning and syllogisms. We will look then at common logic fallacies. We will look at the structure of argument. We'll look at doing documentation in MLA style, and also finally how to avoid plagiarism. First of all, we want to look at logical appeals and persuasive appeals. How information appeals to our sense of reasoning in that comes in two forms. The first is logical appeals. A logical appeal is things that appeal to our intellect, to our reason, to our knowledge, and to our understanding. Persuasive appeals are things that appeal to our emotions, our feelings, our biases, and our prejudices. We would like to think most of the time that we make our decisions strictly on logic, but actually humans are emotional creatures, and many decisions have a strong emotional element to them. Now we want to look at the two forms of reasoning. When you study logic and philosophy, you learn that there are two forms of reasoning that are called inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, or sometimes induction and deduction. Those are the same. Inductive reasoning is thinking that moves from specific information to a general truth or a belief. And deductive reasoning is thinking that moves from a general truth to a specific application and then to a conclusion. Now, we want to look at these in some more detail. First, we'll look at inductive reasoning, thinking that moves from specific information to a general truth or a belief. The way that most people think is that they gather specific bits and pieces of information about various things. This usually comes through observation and learning. We gather bits and pieces of information. When we feel that we have enough information, we make a leap here, and then we believe something. And this is referred to as a general truth or sometimes a general belief. This leap to believing bits and pieces of information, to believing something in general, is known as an inductive leap of faith. I say an inductive leap of faith because it's impossible to know everything about anything, but we can know enough about something to believe something, and that something can be true. Let's look at a specific example here. Let's look at the subject of polar bears. This may seem like an odd subject, but this works with anything. All right? So, polar bears. We're interested in studying about polar bears, and so we gather lots of information about polar bears. Now, everyone we've ever talked to, and every nature program we've ever seen, every book we've ever read, every observation by experts has told us that a polar bear is white. And so we gather all of this specific bits and pieces of information that people have observed over many, many years. And when we have enough information, we believe then that the general truth being that polar bears are white. Matter of fact, we believe all polar bears are white because all the information that's been gathered tells us that they're white. So this is now a general belief, or something that we believe to be true. Alright? And it's a general truth because it says all polar bears are white. Now let's take a look at deductive reasoning. This is when your thinking moves from a general truth to a specific conclusion of some kind. Now, you start with a general truth, something that is believed. You then make a specific application of that truth. This leads you to a conclusion. Alright? Now, deductive reasoning uses what's called a syllogism as its vehicle, and we'll look at that here in a little bit more detail. Alright? A syllogism has three parts. It has a major premise, a minor premise, and it has a conclusion. The major premise is basically the same thing as a general truth or a belief, something that people believe. The minor premise then is a specific application to that belief or that knowledge, and then that brings us to a conclusion of some kind. Alright? Now, the classic example of a syllogism is this one. All men are mortal. Socrates was a man. Socrates is mortal. Alright? The major premise is that all men are mortal. And we know that this is a major premise because it says all. The minor premise, remember, is a specific application. Specifically, we're talking about Socrates. Socrates was a man. The conclusion is Socrates is mortal. And we know that this is true because Socrates is dead, and that's what it means to be mortal. Now, in our specific case, we were believing that all polar bears are white. Now, let's make a specific application of that. Let's say our zoo has a polar bear. Well, our conclusion then would be that our zoo's polar bear will be white. This is the way a syllogism works. However, you must be careful with syllogisms. There are some specific rules that are requirements that they have to follow. First of all, you have to make sure that both the premise are true. Second, make sure the language isn't ambiguous. In other words, that the terminology cannot be understood in different ways, that the terms mean the same. And also make sure that the syllogistic form is valid, which we'll discuss a little more. Because if you don't, then odd things can go wrong. Let's look at this syllogism. All polar bears are white. My cockatiel is white. Therefore, my cockatiel is a polar bear. Obviously, this is very wrong. But let's examine it. First of all, we check the premise. All polar bears are white? Well, we believe that to be true. My cockatiel is white. Well, cockatiels are white. That's also true. Well, if both of these are true, then how can we end up with a wrong conclusion? Is the language ambiguous? Well, no, there are no ambiguous terms in polar bears are white and cockatiel is white. They're pretty much understood. So, why is our conclusion wrong that the cockatiel is a polar bear? Well, here's what's wrong with it. Remember, the third thing is to check to make sure that your syllogistic form is what's known as valid. What that means is the subject of the major premise, in other words, our general truth, must appear in the minor premise. In our example, we see that's what went wrong, because the subject of the major premise is polar bears. Yet in the minor premise, the only thing that is the same is the word white. In other words, the unique characteristic of polar bear, not the subject. Remember, the subject is what has to carry through. Now, when we look at this with the syllogism that we had done previously with polar bears, we can check this and see that it works out all right. It says, all polar bears are white. Our zoo has a polar bear. Therefore, we can see that the subject has carried down into the minor premise. It is repeated in the minor premise. Therefore, our conclusion that Arzu's polar bear is white turns out to be true. So remember that the subject of the major premise must appear in the minor to make it valid. Now, when they talk about inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, as we have here, all right, and then deductive reasoning, they often in textbooks make it seem like these are opposites. Matter of fact, some textbooks will say that. However, this is not actually correct. These two are not opposite each other. Actually, they work together. Let me take a look here with you down at deductive reasoning. Notice that deductive reasoning starts with a general truth. Well, where did that come from? Well, where it came from, we can see, is from inductive reasoning. Likewise, in deductive reasoning, we end up with a conclusion. Our conclusion was that Arzu's polar bear is white. Well, if that's our conclusion and it's true, well, doesn't that as well then show us that it's another specific piece of information that proves all polar bears are white? So you see that inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning actually work together. They work in concert, one to another. Now we want to take a look at some common logic fallacies. Logic fallacies are faulty thinking. Faulty thinking is not an unusual thing. Matter of fact, it's so common with human beings that the different types of fallacies have names, and you can spend many years studying them. We're going to look at just several of the more common ones. Things that you don't want to let confuse you or be fooled by. The first one we're going to talk about is known as a hasty generalization. Remember, a generalization is like a general truth. This is when there is too little evidence or too few examples to come to the conclusion that you came to. Always make sure you have plenty of evidence. Secondly is oversimplification. This is when somebody offers a very simplistic solution to a very complex problem. Very rarely does complex problems have simple solutions. If the solution was that simple, it would already have been solved. And so you have to be careful of conclusions that appear too simplistic. This one is a very famous fallacy. It's known as post hoc, ergo propter hoc, usually just referred to as the post hoc fallacy. It's a Latin term that roughly translated means after this, therefore because of this. Or more clearly, what it means is that this is when people confuse coincidence with a cause. Our lives are lived as a chain of events. Now, if you imply that an early event caused a later event, you must prove that there's a connection between them. You can't simply say an early event caused a later event without showing that they are connected. And the post hoc fallacy is that fallacy. It doesn't prove a connection between events. They need to be proven. Fourth is the non sequitur. This also is a Latin term. And this is when you reach a conclusion that actually isn't supported by evidence. Evidence actually exists, but the conclusion that is drawn from the evidence just doesn't make sense. The next one is known as card stacking. Card stacking is when a person uses only evidence that supports their position and they ignore all evidence that would be against their position. This kind of thinking threatens the credibility of an argument, and it also leaves it open to attack from the opposition if you're only counting on information that supports a position and don't admit that there's any that doesn't support it. The sixth one is known as slanting. Slanting is basically when you use biased language to influence the thinking on a topic. And basically the kind of language that's used is the kind of language that calls something good or calls something bad. And so you try to win the argument by the language that is used to talk about something other than by evidence. The seventh one is known as a false analogy. Now, most of us, we've studied analogies before, and analogies can be useful. But in this case, the analogy that is used is between ideas that actually aren't related. That they make an analogy and it sounds good, but it actually is not a good way of thinking because it does not relate the two ideas together. The eighth one is known as either or. The either or fallacy is when a person admits that there's only two extreme alternatives and no others as a solution to a problem of some kind. This is very rarely the case. Most of the time, there are compromise positions in any type of argument or any type of disagreement. It is very rare that there are only two extreme positions and no compromise positions in the middle. Ninth is called ignoring the question. This is very commonly done, a lot of times on purpose, especially in things like politics and that, where you shift the discussion away from the topic that's being discussed. And there are actually several kinds of this fallacy, and we'll take a look at a couple of the more common ones here. The first one is a fairly famous one known as ad hominem, which means in Latin, against the man. And this fallacy basically is where you attack the person instead of the issue that's being discussed. In other words, you shift the thinking away from the topic at hand and you attack the person who's making the claim. Or you attack, it can be a group or an organization instead of staying on topic. The next one is known as a straw man. A straw man, if you think back to what a scarecrow is, what this is you attack the opposition for unproven views and actions. In other words, a person claims that another person or a group or something believes a certain thing or that they act in a certain way without proving that they do. And then they attack them supposedly for having such views and actions, though there's no proof that they do have them. Begging the question. This is when you assume something that needs to be proven. In other words, as we saw with the syllogism, the major premise and the minor premise have to be true. However, if you simply assume one of them is true and it's not proven true, that can cause a problem with the logic and with the conclusion. The next one is known as shifting the burden of proof. This is when you insist that others, or perhaps your audience, prove that you are wrong instead of offering proof that you are right. Remember, the person who's making the claim or making the argument is the one who is responsible for proving it and for providing the evidence. You can't just say, I believe this and you can't prove it's not true. It is not that person's place to prove something not true. It's your place to prove that it is true. Lastly, we have what's known as circular argument. Circular argument is where basically they just restate the premise or restate their claim instead of providing evidence. So it comes out something that can be kind of silly, like, well, I love mysteries because I've always loved mystery movies. Now, do I understand why you love them? No, you basically just restated what it is that you think and believe. You can't simply restate your thesis and have that be the same as evidence. You need to have facts and quotes and so on. Next, we want to take a look at how an argument is structured. Now, the structure we're going to look at is for a more formal argument. They can be more informal, like editorials in the newspaper, but since we're writing papers and that, we'll look at the formal structure. In the structure of an argument, the first thing that you need to do is state the issue, in other words, your topic, and give any background information that applies to it. And this should be simply information without bias. It should be like you're reading it from an encyclopedia. It's just information at this point. Secondly, you want to mention positions that people take on this issue, from either extreme to the compromise positions or whatever. Just, where do people stand generally in public on this issue? And this again is without prejudice or bias. It's just a statement of fact. Here's what people think about this issue. Third, then, you state your thesis or your position. In other words, make your claim, take your stand on the issue. And then fourth, you want to state your reasons or your points of argument one by one and support each one with evidence. In other words, some fact, a quote, an example, something from a study, some statistics, whatever information you have that supports that point. And you basically just go through your points one by one by one by one, each one, and just elaborate each one of them. That's your argument. Now, fifth, though, in the paper is that you need to also consider refuting any arguments from those who oppose your position. For example, maybe you have a great proposal, but maybe the drawback is, well, it's expensive. Well, in that case, you can't ignore that. You have to admit that it's expensive, and you also have to then have a refutation, which means an opposition point to that to say. You have to say something like, it's true that it's more expensive than other solutions, however, it has great advantages because, or something along those lines. Or you can say, it appears to be more expensive, but however, they are using outdated data. Something that refutes any position that's against yours that was not already brought up in the general argument. Lastly, in an argument, you need to reaffirm your thesis and state your conclusion. All right? By reaffirming your thesis, you can restate it. You may want to mention, if it's a long paper, just your 2 or 3 best argument points. Don't re-argue them, just mention them. And then state your conclusion. Now, an argument should not be subtle. It should be very direct. And so in your conclusion, say what you want. If you want them to agree with you, say so. If you want them to do something specifically, like vote a certain way, buy this, don't buy this, accept this proposal, don't accept it, sign this policy, don't sign this policy, whatever it is you want, state it directly in your conclusion. Now we want to take a look at citing and documentation, and we're going to look at MLA style because that's the way we do it here in the Liberal Arts College. And the easiest way to do it is simply write in the text of your paper. And I've got 2 examples here of how you do that. All right? And basically you just say where you got information. This one says, Dr. Susan Fraser, professor of biology at University of Chicago, in her article, Why We Should Clone Human Tissues for Transplant, said, quote, cloning human tissues from the patient for transplant has many advantages over transplanting tissues from donors. Now, this obviously is a direct quote. Now, because you cited the author and told who she was and what article this came from, you have documented this quote. That is documentation. Likewise, if you simply paraphrased what she said, you didn't quote it directly, but you paraphrased it, you do the same thing, as you see in the second paragraph. Dr. Susan Fraser, the professor of biology at the University of Chicago, in her article, Why We Should Clone Human Tissues for Transplant, said that cloning human organs for transplant has many advantages over transplanting them from other humans. A paraphrase. Notice this. It doesn't matter whether you directly take information and quote it, or whether you paraphrase it. if you use information from anybody or from any source, you must still acknowledge it. And you can do it like this, just right in the text of the sentence or in the paragraph. Now, if you would like to use what's known as parenthetical citations, you can do that after you've first named a person and their data. For example, later in my paper, if I had something else here, a quote from Dr. Fraser, perhaps this quote, "Tissues cloned from the patient do not cause problems with rejection like tissues taken from donors," I don't have to restate all of this Dr. Susan Fraser, professor of biology, and name her article and stuff all over again. I can simply, in parentheses, put Fraser 10. Now, in this case, 10 would refer to the page number in the article where I got that quote that I just used. Same thing with a paraphrase. If you paraphrased her again, you could just put her name. Now, if you're using electronic or internet sources, sometimes they don't have page numbers. In that case, don't use one. Just put in parentheses Fraser, and we know who that is. Now, not only do you have to put citations in your paper when you are using sources or research, you also have to then list them at the end of the paper. This listing is called a works cited in MLA. Works cited has this basic structure. In this case, here's how you would do this particular one. Fraser, Susan. Notice that no titles. You don't put Dr., PhD, you wouldn't put Reverend, Mr., Ms., nothing. Just the name. Fraser, Susan, in reverse order here. Last name first. And then the article. I know that why we should clone human tissues for transplant. I know this is the article title because you put quote marks around it. And then I see American Medical Journal. That is the publication that this article appeared in. I know that because you've underlined it. Notice that MLA does not use italics. It uses underlining for major journals and for books and stuff like that. So underline. Then there's a date, 20 August 2006. That would refer to the date that that article was published. And you need to try to find that out if you can. And then it says 6 December 2008. That would refer to the date I found or I accessed the article on the internet. And that date has to be there if you took information from the internet. You must keep a record of the date that you find information and report it in your works cited. And then you notice we have the URL. It shouldn't be read and underlined, but I couldn't control that. So this is what the works cited would look like. Now these are just quick examples. You need to look in your textbook in the back or check your reference guide. For us, that's the Quick College Guide, for more information and details on how you do citing and how you do documentation of sources. But you must do documentation. If you don't, it can run into problems. The problem that it can run into is plagiarism, and I want to tell you how you can avoid that. First of all, what is plagiarism? Plagiarism is when you use information. Whether you quote it directly or paraphrase it, doesn't matter. If you use information in your paper and you do not give credit to the author from whom you took it, that's plagiarism. It's like borrowing without permission. It's stealing of information. So you don't want to take information without telling where you got it from. Alright, so always state in your paper from whom and where your information and your quotes came from by one of the ways that we looked at previously, and then include those in your works cited page at the end of your paper. Be cautious, because penalties for plagiarism can be very harsh. In some schools, they will expel you for plagiarism, so be careful. So what do I want you to remember from this discussion on argument? Well, first of all, I want you to remember that An argument tries to convince somebody by using logic and persuasion to agree with your point of view or to follow a particular course of action, or do both. And you need to take these under consideration. Consider logical appeal and persuasive appeal of your topic, the inductive and deductive reasoning, avoid logic fallacies and faulty thinking, get the structure of the argument right, don't forget to do the citation and documentation, and avoid plagiarism. Now, these are my sources for this particular presentation, and you will have some for the papers that you do. Remember to refer to your texts. They will help you. All right, that'll do it.